Late April, 1945. The war in Europe was dying, but it had not yet gone quietly. Across southern Germany, the earth still trembled under the weight of advancing American armor. The skies were gray, heavy with smoke and the distant echo of artillery. And on the outskirts of a quiet Bavarian town, a place of suffering and silence stood waiting for its final reckoning, Stalag VII-A. The heavy iron gates of the camp loomed like something out of a nightmare. Rusted, reinforced, and built to keep men from hope itself. For years, those gates had only opened in one direction, bringing prisoners in. But now, for the first time, they were about to be forced open from the outside. The sound came first. A deep, mechanical growl. Steel tracks grinding against dirt roads. Engines roaring with unstoppable momentum. The men inside the camp, those who still had the strength to stand, turned their heads toward the noise. Some thought they were dreaming. Others feared it was just another cruel trick of fate. But then it grew louder. Closer. American tanks. The soldiers of the United States 14th Armored Division, part of General George S. Patton's relentless Third Army, were pushing forward without hesitation. These were not parade soldiers. These were battle-hardened men, covered in dust, oil, and exhaustion. They had fought through burning towns, shattered defenses, and desperate German resistance. And now, they had reached the gates of one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps in Germany. There was no ceremony. One of the lead Sherman tanks didn't slow down. It didn't wait for permission. With a deafening crash, it surged forward and smashed through the outer barriers. Wood splintered. Metal groaned. The gates that had symbolized imprisonment for tens of thousands of men were torn apart in seconds. Inside the camp, time seemed to stop. Then everything exploded. Men who had not smiled in months began to scream. Some fell to their knees. Others ran, stumbling, collapsing, crawling through the mud just to get closer to the tanks. Their uniforms hung off their bodies like torn cloth. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. These were not the men who had been captured. These were shadows of them. But they were alive. The American tanks rolled into the courtyard, their engines still rumbling, their steel hulls marked with the white star of liberation. Soldiers climbed out, scanning their surroundings. At first, there was relief. Victory. Another objective taken. But that feeling didn't last. As their eyes adjusted to what stood before them, the smiles faded. What they saw wasn't a military facility. It was something far worse. Rows of skeletal figures. Men barely able to stand. The smell of sickness, decay, and starvation hung thick in the air. These weren't just prisoners. These were Americans. Brothers. Soldiers. Airmen who had once worn the same uniform. And in that moment, something shifted inside the men of the 14th Armored Division. This was no longer just another advance in a collapsing war. This was something personal. As the chaos of liberation filled the camp, another figure emerged from the far side of the compound. The German commandant. He stepped out of his headquarters slowly, deliberately, as if nothing around him had changed. His uniform was pristine, pressed to perfection. His boots gleamed despite the mud beneath them. Medals rested neatly on his chest, catching the faint spring light. He walked forward with confidence. With composure. As if he were about to attend a formal ceremony. Not the collapse of everything he had built. Not the judgment waiting for him just a few steps ahead. He approached the American commander standing near the shattered gates. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. One man, clean, polished, untouched by suffering. The other covered in dust, eyes hardened by everything he had just witnessed. The German officer stopped. He clicked his heels together sharply. Then raised his hand in a perfect, formal salute. And for a brief moment, in the middle of destruction, starvation, and liberation, he expected it to be returned. The German commandant stood tall in the center of the ruined courtyard, his posture rigid, his chin slightly raised, his expression calm, almost rehearsed. Around him, chaos unfolded. Starving prisoners wept openly. American soldiers shouted orders. Tanks idled loudly, their engines still rumbling like distant thunder. But the commandant seemed untouched by it all. In his mind, this moment was not chaos. It was ceremony. He had prepared for this. For years, he had lived within a very specific worldview, one shaped by rigid military tradition, aristocratic pride, and a deeply ingrained belief in hierarchy. To him, war was not just violence. It was structure. It was rank. It was order. Even now, as his nation crumbled and his authority evaporated, he clung to that belief with absolute conviction. He believed in the idea of a gentleman's war. A war where officers respected each other. Where surrender, even in defeat, was handled with dignity. Where a man of rank would be treated as a man of rank, no matter the outcome of the battlefield. And above all, he believed that he deserved that respect. The commandant's polished boots pressed firmly into the muddy ground as he held his salute, waiting. His gloved hand remained perfectly still. His eyes fixed on the American officer in front of him, not with fear, but with expectation. He had seen this before, at least in training, in doctrine, in the stories passed down through generations of officers. The defeated commander offers his surrender. The victorious officer accepts it with professionalism. A handshake follows. Perhaps even a nod of mutual respect between soldiers. Civilized men. That was how he saw himself. Not as a jailer. Not as a man responsible for the suffering behind him. But as an officer. A professional. A participant in a structured conflict governed by rules. The starving men behind the barbed wire did not exist in that version of reality. Or if they did, they were simply part of the system. Necessary. Irrelevant to the ritual now unfolding. The commandant expected the American officer to recognize his uniform. To see the insignia. The medals. The signs of rank and experience. He expected to be acknowledged not for what he had done, but for who he believed he was. A man of status. A man of discipline. A man worthy of respect, even in defeat. But what made this moment so striking, so deeply unsettling, was how completely detached he was from the truth surrounding him. Just a few yards behind him stood thousands of men reduced to skin and bone. Men who had been starved, humiliated, and pushed to the brink of death under his command. Men who had suffered not because of war, but because of deliberate cruelty. And yet, none of that seemed to register. He adjusted his stance slightly, maintaining perfect posture. His uniform, untouched by hardship, contrasted violently with the broken bodies behind him. Even now, at the very end, he carried himself as if he were still in control. As if the war had not already judged him. Because in his mind, surrender did not mean disgrace. It meant transition. He believed that once the formalities were complete, he would be treated accordingly. Perhaps even given certain privileges as a high-ranking officer. He expected to be separated from the chaos, handled with care, and processed through the proper channels. Order would return. That was what he believed. What he failed to understand, what he could not understand, was that the men standing in front of him were not thinking about protocol. They were not thinking about tradition. They were not thinking about the rules of a gentleman's war. They were thinking about the men behind the wire. About the hollow faces. The shaking hands. The quiet deaths that had happened day after day, just out of sight of the world. And as the commandant held his salute, waiting for it to be returned, he had no idea that the very idea of a gentleman's surrender had already died the moment those gates were broken. The American officer didn't move. For a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow into a single, silent standoff. The German commandant stood frozen in perfect form, his salute unwavering, his expression calm. He was waiting, for acknowledgement, for respect, for the ritual to unfold exactly as he had imagined. But the American commander's eyes never rose to meet the salute. Instead, they drifted past him. Slowly, deliberately, as if drawn by something far more powerful than military tradition, the American officer looked beyond the polished uniform, beyond the medals, beyond the man himself. And what he saw changed everything. Behind the barbed wire stood the prisoners. At first glance, they didn't even look like soldiers. They looked like shadows. Figures barely held together by skin and bone. Their uniforms hung off their bodies like loose fabric on empty frames. Faces were hollow, cheeks sunken so deeply it seemed impossible they were still alive. Some of them stared blankly, as if their minds hadn't yet caught up with what was happening. Others reached forward weakly, trembling hands stretching toward the American tanks, toward the soldiers, toward anything that represented escape from the nightmare they had endured. One man tried to stand, and collapsed immediately into the mud. Another leaned against the fence, his strength completely gone, tears running silently down a face that had long since forgotten what hope felt like. These weren't prisoners of war in the traditional sense. These were survivors of something far darker. The American officer's jaw tightened. Every instinct of discipline, every rule of engagement, every expectation of how a surrender should proceed, began to crumble under the weight of what stood before him. He had seen death before. He had seen men fall in battle, had led troops through gunfire, through artillery, through chaos. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was neglect. Starvation. Slow, deliberate destruction. His eyes moved across the crowd, taking in every detail. The skeletal arms. The torn clothing. The vacant stares. And with each passing second, the realization grew heavier. These were his men. Americans. Soldiers who had once stood proud, trained, and ready. Men who had families waiting for them. Lives that had been put on hold the moment they were captured. And now, they looked like they had been erased. The sounds of celebration around him, the cheering, the cries of relief, began to fade into the background. All he could focus on was the overwhelming contrast between what should have been, and what was. Behind him, his own troops had begun reacting as well. Some shouted in anger. Others stood in stunned silence. A few reached into their pockets, already pulling out rations, chocolate, cigarettes, anything they could offer. But even as they moved to help, the weight of the moment pressed down on all of them. Because there was one undeniable truth that none of them could ignore. This hadn't happened by accident. This had been allowed. Controlled. Enforced. And the man responsible was standing just a few feet away, still holding his salute. The American officer slowly shifted his gaze back toward the German commandant. For the first time, their eyes met. But there was no recognition in the American's expression. No respect. No acknowledgement of rank or status. Only something cold. Something unyielding. The kind of anger that doesn't explode, but hardens. The commandant's arm was still raised, his posture still perfect, but now, for the first time, there was the slightest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Something wasn't right. The moment wasn't unfolding the way it should. Because the American officer wasn't seeing a fellow soldier. He wasn't seeing an equal. He was seeing the man who had stood behind these fences, while everything behind him slowly died. And in that moment, without a word spoken, without a single order given, the entire foundation of a gentleman's surrender collapsed. The salute remained unanswered. And the silence that followed was far more powerful than any response. Long before the gates were broken, long before the American tanks rolled into the camp, there was only survival. Behind the barbed wire of Stalag VII-A, time did not move normally. Days blended into nights, and nights into endless stretches of cold, hunger, and waiting. The outside world felt like something distant, almost imaginary. For the tens of thousands of prisoners trapped inside, life had been reduced to a single, brutal question. How long can a man endure? The camp had never been meant to hold so many. Originally designed for around 10,000 prisoners, it had been pushed far beyond its limits as the war dragged on. By 1945, more than 80,000 men were crammed into a space that could barely sustain a fraction of that number. Every inch of ground was occupied. Barracks overflowed. Makeshift shelters were thrown together from scraps of wood and torn fabric. Some men didn't even have a roof over their heads, forced to sleep in the open, exposed to the brutal elements of a southern German winter. The cold was relentless. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and without proper clothing or blankets, the prisoners had no real defense against it. They wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: old newspapers, rags, even pieces of cardboard, anything that might trap a little warmth. It rarely worked. At night, the camp became a place of quiet suffering. Men lay awake, shivering uncontrollably, listening to the wind cut through the broken structures around them. Some didn't wake up in the morning. But as deadly as the cold was, it wasn't the worst part. The true weapon used against the prisoners was starvation. Food was not just scarce, it was intentionally insufficient. The daily ration barely qualified as nourishment. A single slice of dark, heavy bread, often filled with sawdust or other fillers, was meant to last an entire day. Alongside it, a thin, watery soup made from rotting turnips, weeds, or whatever scraps could be gathered. It wasn't enough. Not even close. Strong, healthy soldiers began to waste away within weeks. Muscles disappeared. Energy drained. The human body, deprived of the fuel it needed to function, began consuming itself just to survive. Men who had once weighed over 180 or 200 pounds were reduced to less than 100. Their uniforms, once fitted and sharp, now hung loosely from their frames. Their belts had to be tightened again and again, until there was nothing left to tighten. Hunger became constant. Not just a feeling, but a presence. A dull, gnawing pain that never went away. It followed them everywhere, in the barracks, in the roll calls, even in their dreams. Some men talked about food endlessly, describing meals they remembered from home. Others stopped talking altogether, conserving what little energy they had left. And then came the disease. With so many men packed together in unsanitary conditions, illness spread rapidly. Dysentery tore through the camp, leaving men weak and dehydrated. Typhus brought fever and delirium. Pneumonia settled into lungs already weakened by cold and starvation. There was little to no medical care. If a man got sick, he either recovered on his own, or he didn't. Death became part of the routine. Not dramatic. Not loud. Quiet. Almost unnoticed. A man would lie down at night, too weak to speak, too tired to move, and by morning he was gone. His body would be carried away, and his place would be taken by someone else still fighting to survive. And through it all, the barbed wire remained. A constant reminder that there was no escape. No relief. No end in sight. This wasn't just imprisonment. It was a slow, grinding process of breaking the human body and spirit, day by day, piece by piece. And just beyond those fences, in warm buildings with full meals and clean uniforms, the men responsible carried on as if none of it mattered. At first, the changes were small. Almost unnoticeable. A soldier might feel a little weaker during morning roll call. His steps slower, his posture slightly less rigid. Hunger would linger a bit longer than usual. Fatigue would settle deeper into his bones. But in the early days of captivity, many still believed they could endure it. They told themselves it was temporary. That the war would end soon. That rescue would come. That this, whatever it was, could not last forever. But it did. And over time, those small changes became impossible to ignore. Inside Stalag VII-A, the human body was slowly stripped of everything that made it strong. Without proper food, without rest, without care, the transformation was inevitable. Muscle was the first to go. Men who had once trained daily, who had carried heavy packs and marched for miles without hesitation, began to lose their strength. Their arms thinned. Their legs weakened. Even standing for long periods became a challenge. Then came the weight loss. Rapid. Unforgiving. Uniforms that once fit snugly now hung loosely, sleeves draping over arms that had lost all definition. Faces became sharper, cheekbones more pronounced, until the skin seemed stretched thin over the skull beneath. Eyes sank deeper into their sockets. And with that physical decline came something even more dangerous. The slow collapse of the mind. Hope didn't disappear all at once. It faded. Quietly. At first, men spoke of home. Of families. Of the meals they would eat when they returned. They shared stories, laughed when they could, held on to anything that reminded them of who they had been before the wire. But as weeks turned into months, those conversations grew less frequent. Energy was too scarce. Even speaking required effort. Some men withdrew into silence, conserving what little strength they had left. Others stared blankly ahead for hours, their thoughts distant, unreachable. It became harder to remember what normal life felt like. Harder to believe it still existed. The camp didn't just starve the body. It starved the spirit. Humiliation was constant. Prisoners were forced to stand in formation for long roll calls, even in freezing temperatures, even when they were barely able to remain upright. If someone faltered, if they failed to meet the rigid expectations imposed on them, punishment followed. There was no dignity. No privacy. No escape from the feeling of being reduced to something less than human. And death became familiar. Not shocking. Not sudden. Expected. A man would weaken over days, sometimes weeks. His movements slower, his voice quieter. Fellow prisoners would notice, but there was little they could do. Everyone was fighting the same battle. Eventually, he would lie down. And not get back up. There were no ceremonies. No proper goodbyes. Just a silent understanding that another life had slipped away, claimed not by bullets or explosions, but by neglect. By starvation. By time. The living had no choice but to keep going. To step over the spaces left behind. To endure. And yet, despite everything, despite the hunger, the sickness, the constant presence of death, something remained. A fragile, flickering instinct to survive. Some men held onto it through routine. Others through memory. A letter kept hidden. A name repeated quietly in the dark. A promise made to themselves that they would see home again, no matter how impossible it seemed. That instinct, as weak as it was, refused to disappear completely. Even as their bodies failed, even as their strength vanished, even as the camp took everything it could from them, they endured. Barely. And when liberation finally came, when the sound of American tanks broke through the silence, it did not find soldiers waiting. It found survivors. Men who had been pushed to the very edge of existence. And somehow, had not fallen off. What happened inside that camp was not an isolated moment. It wasn't a single act of anger, or a one-time decision made in the heat of emotion. What unfolded at Stalag VII-A was part of something larger, something that repeated itself across the collapsing front lines of Nazi Germany in the final weeks of the war. As Allied forces pushed deeper into enemy territory, they began uncovering more camps. Some smaller. Some larger. All carrying the same unmistakable signs of neglect, starvation, and systematic cruelty. And with each new discovery, the reaction was the same. Shock. Then anger. Then something far more deliberate. The men of Third Army, advancing under George S. Patton, were among the first to encounter many of these sights. They had spent months fighting through some of the harshest conditions of the European campaign. They had seen destruction, loss, and the brutal realities of war. But nothing prepared them for this. Because this wasn't battle. There were no trenches. No exchanged fire. No equal fight. What they found were men who had been broken slowly, deliberately, over time. And standing at the center of it all were the men responsible. Camp commandants. Officers. Guards. Many of them reacted in the same way. Just like at Stalag VII-A, they stepped forward expecting order. Expecting procedure. Expecting to be treated as soldiers surrendering to soldiers. Some arrived in full uniform, medals intact, posture rigid. They saluted. They offered their sidearms. They attempted to follow the script of a formal military surrender. They believed that the system still applied to them. That rank still mattered. That dignity would be preserved. But time and again, they were wrong. The American response was not random. It was not uncontrolled rage. It was something more calculated, more symbolic. First came the stripping of authority. Weapons removed. Belts taken. Medals pulled from uniforms. The visible signs of rank and power were erased in seconds. What had once defined these men was reduced to nothing more than decoration, now meaningless in the face of what had been uncovered. Then came the reversal. In several camps, liberating soldiers did something that went far beyond standard military procedure. They turned to the prisoners, the victims, and brought them forward. Not as bystanders. Not as witnesses. But as participants. Rifles were handed over. Positions were shifted. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners stood not behind the wire, but in front of it. And the guards, those who had once held absolute control, found themselves in a position they had never imagined. Exposed. Powerless. Watched. In some cases, they were ordered to sit, to kneel, to remain still under the eyes of the very men they had starved, punished, and dismissed as inferior. No violence was necessary. No shots fired. Because the impact of the moment didn't come from physical force. It came from recognition. The realization that everything they had believed, their superiority, their authority, their untouchable status, was gone. Completely. And for the prisoners, the experience was just as powerful. Many were too weak to speak. Too exhausted to react with anything beyond quiet disbelief. But in those moments, standing upright, holding a weapon, watching their former captors lowered into submission, something returned. Not strength. Not fully. But dignity. A sense, however brief, that the balance had been restored. That what had been taken from them was being acknowledged. Across multiple camps, these scenes unfolded in different forms, but always with the same core message. This was not just liberation. It was reckoning. A confrontation between what had been done and what could no longer be denied. And as the war came to its final end, these moments stood as a powerful reminder. That victory wasn't only measured by territory gained or battles won, but by the restoration of humanity. In places where it had almost disappeared completely. When the war in Europe finally came to an end in May of 1945, the world began the long process of understanding what had truly happened behind the front lines. Battles had been fought. Cities had been destroyed. Armies had clashed across continents. But in places like Stalag VII-A, the story of the war was not written in explosions or advancing maps. It was written in silence. In starvation. In the slow, deliberate breaking of men who had once stood strong. And when liberation came, when the soldiers of Third Army under George S. Patton finally tore through those gates, it did more than end captivity. It exposed truth. A truth that could not be softened by formalities or hidden behind military tradition. Because in the aftermath of that discovery, one question remained. What does justice look like, in a place where humanity has been stripped away? For generations, warfare had followed certain expectations. Even in conflict, there were rules, codes of conduct, traditions of surrender, the idea that officers on both sides could still recognize each other as professionals. A gentleman's war. But what the American soldiers found inside those camps shattered that idea completely. There was nothing gentlemanly about starvation. Nothing honorable about neglect. Nothing civilized about watching thousands of men waste away behind barbed wire. And so, when the moment came for surrender, when the camp commandant stepped forward expecting respect, expecting dignity, expecting the ritual to be followed, the Americans made a choice. They refused. Not out of chaos. Not out of blind anger. But out of clarity. They understood that to accept a polite surrender would be to validate the illusion these men had built around themselves. It would allow them to walk away believing they had simply lost a war, not that they had overseen suffering on a scale that demanded acknowledgement. So instead, the Americans changed the terms. They stripped away the symbols of rank. The polished belts. The medals. The carefully maintained image of authority. They removed the distance between the powerful and the powerless. And in its place, they created something far more honest. Accountability. By placing weapons into the hands of former prisoners, by forcing commandants to sit in the same mud their captives had suffered in, By denying them the dignity they believed was guaranteed, they sent a message that went far beyond that single moment. Power built on cruelty is temporary. Authority without humanity is hollow. And no uniform, no rank, no title can shield a man from the consequences of what he has done. For the prisoners, that moment did not erase the suffering they had endured. It did not restore the months or years lost behind the wire. It did not heal the physical damage or bring back those who had died. But it gave them something that had been taken from them piece by piece. Recognition. A quiet, powerful acknowledgement that what had happened to them mattered. That it had been seen. That it would not be ignored or brushed aside in the name of protocol. And for the men who had once believed themselves untouchable, it delivered something equally lasting. Perspective. A sudden, undeniable understanding that the roles they had enforced so confidently could be reversed in an instant. That the system they relied on had collapsed. That they were no longer above anyone. They were simply men. Defeated. Exposed. Remembered not for their rank, but for their actions. History often remembers war through strategy, through leadership, through the movement of armies across maps. But moments like this remind us that the true weight of war is carried by individuals, by the choices they make, and the consequences that follow. Because in the end, victory is not just about defeating an enemy. It is about restoring what was nearly lost. And in the mud of a broken camp, surrounded by survivors who refused to disappear, justice, in its most human form, finally stood its ground,